Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. A confidential collection of government documents obtained by the U.S. newspaper, The Washington Post, revealed that U.S. officials at almost all levels were making false statements about the war in Afghanistan and hiding facts. The truth, according to these documents, was unmistakable. The war was unwinnable. The effort began with a federal project which sought to examine the failure of the longest-running conflict in U.S. history. It includes interviews with people directly involved in conducting the war, generals, diplomats, other officials from Bush, Obama, and now Trump administrations, and also Afghan officials. The U.S. government tried to hide the identities of those interviewed and conceal nearly all their comments. The Post had to wage a 3-year legal battle under the Freedom of Information Act to get the papers released. The release of these papers can also be titled Pentagon Papers Redux. The Pentagon Papers are a U.S. Department of Defense history of America's involvement in Vietnam from 1945 to 1967. The papers were released by Daniel Ellsberg. They were first published by the U.S. newspaper, The New York Times, in 1971. A 1996 article in The New York Times said that the Pentagon Papers had demonstrated, among other things, that the Johnson administration, and I quote from that, systematically lied not only to the public, but also to Congress, unquote. Nothing has changed since then. The U.S. can bomb everything but achieve virtually nothing. To discuss the contents of these papers, we are joined today by Lieutenant General Waheed Arshad, who is a former Chief of General Staff of the Pakistan Army, Mr. Shafiq Hamdam, who is an analyst, a writer, and a political activist, joins us from Washington, D.C., and Dr. Mark Meirowitz, who is a professor at the State University of New York Maritime College. Thank you to all of you. Let me begin with Dr. Meirowitz. Dr. Meirowitz, I'm assuming you've gone through, if not all of the papers, but most of it. What is your sense? As I said, this is like the Pentagon Papers Redux. Nothing seems to have changed.
Right. I don't think it's so comparable. It's comparable in the sense that the Pentagon Papers was different in the sense that this was released through leaks and read on the floor of the Senate. It was a classified document. It was in litigation as to whether this was permissible. There were grand juries. It was a very different situation. This was done by an inspector general, and it was released through Freedom of Information Act. So on the comparison,
so I was basically referring not to the difference in technicalities of how the Pentagon Papers came out and how this one came out. I was saying that was about the Johnson administration lying to the public and Congress, and now we're told that 3 administrations also lied to the public with reference to what was happening in Afghanistan. So that was the comparison that I was trying to make.
I see the point, but to my mind, after looking into it, to me it's moot at this point, in the sense that it's a matter of political accountability. That's the political leaders making these upbeat statements, and the military accountability, where the military leaders are making statements. You look at it, I think the one thing that comes out of this is sort of Rumsfeld's attitude and the way in which he these snowflakes where he is making these comments about what's going on and the public is unaware of it. At the present time, I think that, we have to sort of think about where we go forward and not focus backward, even though it's quite, disturbing to read about it, because we have to figure out what we're going to do going forward. If the point of it is that it's hopeless and that we should pull out the American troops, if that's the point of it, then I don't agree with that, because at this present time, the situation is too precarious to do that. In retrospect, and thinking about how we got to where we are, that's a worthwhile analysis.
Okay, let me quote from what General Douglas Lute said. And he said, we were devoid of a fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. We didn't know what we were doing. This is someone who was the White House Afghan war czar during the Bush and Obama administration. Then he also said, what are we trying to do here? We didn't have the foggiest notion of what we were undertaking. Those are very strong words. And this is someone who was involved very, at the center of the war effort in 2 administrations. did he arrive at these conclusions post getting out of that position? Was he voicing them at that time? If he were voicing them at that time, was someone listening? These are all very interesting questions because, hindsight is 2020, and we now see that the war effort hasn't really gone anywhere, either on the ground militarily or in terms of nation building or in terms of building the Afghan National Defense Forces.
Well, I mean, as you say, it's a sad thing to look at it in retrospect, and as you say, 2020 is hindsight. The truth of the matter is there is a good parallel to Vietnam, maybe not to the Pentagon Papers per se, in the sense that the United States know what it was doing when it got into Vietnam. Well, it didn't. And once it got into it, to quote Rumsfeld, it was a quagmire, and nobody knew how to get out of it. So the only way to deal with it was to make these statements and just keep plodding forward and muddling through, never knowing what to do. But this is a broader question in American foreign policy. When America intervenes or becomes involved in these foreign conflicts, whether or not the administration, the military, as you say, have the foggiest notion of what they're doing, in the sense particularly of knowing the country, the people, what is the situation there. And that has been a thread in American foreign policy.
But Mark, frankly, since you are an academic also, in addition to observing policy and commenting on policy, a number of people, I mean, Meirowitz, Walt, Andrew Besowich, I mean, the list is long, have been writing about it, whether they're writing about how the U.S. has fared in the greater Middle East, whether they're writing about Iraq or Iran or Afghanistan. Does anyone listen, really?
Well, I mean, I don't know that Meirowitz and Walt are higher on my list of my preferred foreign policy analysts in their criticism. But the thing is, certainly, if you look at where we are today. I think that's important to keep in mind. We now have a different approach. Whether it's good or bad is debatable. But this Trump doctrine, this idea that the United States does not want to be involved in foreign conflicts, maybe because getting into them become quagmires, and maybe we should be pulling out of these foreign conflicts. But bottom line is, where does the stability end up? How do you end up with these impossible situations, and how do you deal with them if they're impossible?
That's a good question, Mark. We shall take this up further. Thank you so much for speaking with. That was Dr. Mark Meirowitz. General Arshad, sir, since 2010, 2013, you were in the thick of things, and this was also a time when relations were going sour. There were things that you were telling the American generals also and the diplomats also. Give us a sense of, walk us through, viewers, especially international viewers, what was it that you were telling them, and how come they never listened to that?
Well, Ejaz, one has to go back to the period between 2001 and end of 2008.
Correct.
And that's the time when initially, after the US offensive, the ISAF, when it entered Afghanistan, another 2 to 3 years down the line, 4 years, there was this environment which was created where the Taliban were down and out. They didn't have that kind of controlled arrangement of their own people. They had lost a lot of ground support also. The country was ripe for post-military, actions and work to be done, because the military operations can only create an environment, especially when you are an invading country in a foreign territory. So you can create an environment, but then for achieving stability, you need political, cultural, social development activity. And that was the time, and those years from 2004-5 to 2008 didn't happen. They had this concept of PRTs, provincial reconstruction teams, and so on and so forth. Got marred in corruption and, bickering and groups and because they were all warlords and their groups and their influences and all those things. Post 2008, they realized when the Taliban started to regroup and gain a lot of ground support and started to the US troops and other ISAF troops started to getting, suffering casualties. You saw the surge of 2009 when President Obama announced publicly the surge, addressing the U.S. military, and then they had the highest level of more than 150,000 troops there. But the problem was that from 2001 till 2008 and then thereafter, the strategy totally was dependent on what the military would do, nothing else. The military was fighting a conventional war. The war was not conventional at all. So the Taliban had a different concept of war fighting. So when you, and the strategic interest of the US forces, the ISAF, lay in the south, Kandahar, Taliban strongholds, Helmand, other places. The Pakistan army was conducting its operations, and those are the times, if you remember, 2008, post-2008 was the TTP in its full strength, starting from Swat onwards. So our focus was on the north. And we had told the American ISAF command that we are doing these operations, they're going to run to Afghanistan, you are not there, you're all in the south. So what are you doing in the south? You need to come north if we are going to have joint operations and a hammer and anvil approach.
So it became a revolving door.
So it was basically a strategic disconnect. The ISAF was focusing on the Taliban hinterland, the strength of the Taliban on ground, Kandahar, Helmand, other places. They forgot about the real factor that unless they, secure areas which they have left, and the Taliban, when they went into south, the Taliban just moved up north, closer to the Pakistan border, we call, Paktia and all those provinces.
The Loya Paktia area.
So what happened was that when you use military strength against an enemy which is not fighting a conventional war, is not entrenched, is everywhere. So this is what happens. So you have a strategic disconnect where we were conducting operations against TTP, which were using the borders to go into Afghanistan, then come back, carry out attacks on our forces, then go back. And they were doing it freely because there was nobody there to check. The Afghan forces obviously were not in a position. The American forces didn't want to go there because their strategy forced them to go south. So that strategic disconnect continued. And if you look at the strategic disconnect, so when there was this focus on the military operations, there was no focus on the political arm or the socio-economic arm. So at the end of the day, they found that the military option didn't work because they couldn't, one, secure area, they couldn't kill all the Taliban, they couldn't sort of defeat all the ground support which the Taliban had. And then when they propped up a lot of, counter-Taliban growths, warlords, they found that the Afghan National Army which they were training were actually reporting to the warlords and not to the Afghan government. So they were in a situation where, one, they couldn't achieve their military objectives. Second, since they didn't have a politico-economic strategy, they were not going anywhere. The amount of aid which was pumped into Afghanistan all went into this kleptocracy and corruption.
That's a very important point. And on that note, I want to go over to Shafiq Hamdam. Mr. Hamdam, the papers also, I just quoted Douglas Lute saying that we didn't have the foggiest idea of what we were doing. We didn't understand Afghanistan. So that is one thing, not being able to understand Afghanistan. It was the same mistake that the Soviet Union made. They also didn't really understand Afghanistan. But additionally, the issue of the monies coming in and then a lot of corruption that the papers talk about, in fact, to the point where Mr. Hamid Karzai seems to have shot back at the US itself. Give us a sense as an Afghan analyst of what do you make of these papers and the war effort in Afghanistan?
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum. Actually, I believe the paper, released things which is not very new. It is very well known. For example, probably you have heard so many times that the Afghanistan war is in stalemate. It was a public statement by the commander of NATO and US forces in Afghanistan 2 years ago. And you know clearly that there are generals who were fired, like General McChrystal, 4-star General, General McNain, and so many other generals, ambassadors, diplomats. They have had the same view and visions, and they have spoken about it to the public as well as to the Congress and the government publicly. But I'm glad that this report is coming as a compiled more on a paper rather than a piece of code here and there. But overall, I think, yes, there is corruption in Afghanistan. It has boomed after 2001 because there was a lot of mismanagement of money coming to Afghanistan, aids coming to Afghanistan, and meanwhile, return of some warlords back into the power. But looking from, as an Afghan to other perspective or from other perspective, there is tremendous achievement for the U.S. presence in Afghanistan if it comes in terms of countering terrorism. Osama bin Laden was killed in Pakistan, Mullah Mansoor was killed in Pakistan, and Mullah Omar died in Pakistan as well as a lot of masterminds of 9/11 was captured in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And I think U.S. and overall the entire West is safer than ever before 2011.
Okay, on that note, just an interjection, Mr. Hamdam. And again, I'm quoting from these papers. This is Jeffrey Eggers, who's a retired Navy SEAL and White House staffer for Bush and Obama. He says, and I quote, "What did we get for this $1 trillion effort? Was it worth $1 trillion? And then he added, "After the killing of Osama bin Laden, I said that Osama was probably laughing in his watery grave, considering how much we have spent on Afghanistan." So, in terms of the achievements that you're talking about, if you juxtapose them with what the US has actually achieved, the whole idea of socio-economic and political re-engineering, which began with the Bush administration, to the point where Obama said that we are not looking for Jeffersonian democracy in Afghanistan, to the point where it's just about counterterrorism operations, the bar has constantly come down. And Afghanistan's socio-economic and political structures today are as weak and feeble as they were when the war started.
I would disagree that the socioeconomic situation in Afghanistan is as weak as it was in 2001. There has been tremendous development. Of course, the money spent in Afghanistan is massive. It's not exactly, probably even not the half of money which has been spent that you can calculate or you can be accountable for. Money has been spent so much. There has been corruption, not only Afghans, but also, international partners. They have been involved in corruption. And let's not forget the fact that there has been war and there is an ongoing war in Afghanistan. Conflict is not over. And we are optimistic. And I personally believe that the achievement of this all investment in Afghanistan, other than having a constitution, elected government, and as well as, strong national defense and security forces, my optimism is depends on the negotiations in Qatar. I think if there is a settlement between the US Afghan government and Taliban, I think everything has been spent in Afghanistan is worth it. Certainly for the United States, we talk about $1 trillion. It's not a lot of money because there is $680 billion per year for the defense budget. And for the last
I'm not sure if the American taxpayer is going to agree with you, but thank you so much, Shafiq Hamdam, speaking with us. Before I take a break, Ejaz Haider, it says every data point was altered to present the best possible picture. This is Bob Crowley, an Army colonel, who served as a senior counterinsurgency advisor to U.S. military commanders in 2013 and 2014. And he said that surveys, for instance, were totally unreliable, but reinforced that everything we were doing was right, and we became a self-licking ice cream cone. That's a very interesting analogy. So tell us about, you talked about the strategic disconnect. In fact, it is nearly 750,000 US soldiers in terms of rotation that went through Afghanistan, which is a much larger number than the entire strength of the Pakistan Army. And Pakistan Army itself is, I think, 6th or 7th largest army in the world. So they don't really have much to show for that. If you make a comparison with what we managed to do here, how would you do that? I mean, what was the difference?
See, I think the first major difference was that actually US, ISAF were in Afghanistan was seen as occupation powers.
Okay.
It's an occupation army. So it has its own dynamics, its own drawbacks. We were in our own country. We were fighting with people, a lot of them which belonged to Pakistan. Mm-hmm. They were fighting, they had taken up arms against the state for their own reasons, for their own narratives. They had a lot of support from Afghanistan. But the basic difference was that their narrative was that we were supporting the US war in Afghanistan against their fellow, ethnic brothers and against Muslims and so on and so forth. The narrative of Afghanistan was that we were fighting against an occupation power. So that needed to be understood by the US ISAF strategists, that you're in a foreign country, your strategic objective was to defeat Al-Qaeda. You've done that. You did that a long time back. Most of the Al-Qaeda people fled from Afghanistan, came into Pakistan. It was Pakistan who caught them. And other Al-Qaeda affiliates like TTP, it was Pakistan who defeated them. So that difference was not understood by them. Secondly, see, unless you create a difference between the organizations like the Taliban or the TTP, for example, and their support base amongst the people, you're not going anywhere. This is what we did. When the TTP coined their narratives and the slogans, initially they had some support. But then our narrative actually turned the whole thing around by showing to the people that actually their narrative is a false narrative. They're not fighting for anybody else but for their own power.
I believe that a very extensive and intensive exercise was undertaken in the Pakistan Army in terms of narrating to the younger officers and the soldiers and informing them of the TTP narrative and how it was a false narrative, how it was a dangerous narrative.
Not only that, I mean, we did it for our own army also, and we did it for the people especially of people of FATA and the KP province, because initially there was a lot of ground support for these people, because their narrative was that there is an occupation army in Afghanistan, and if we could fight against the Russians, why couldn't we fight against the Americans? So you had to do something to beat that narrative. And the second narrative they built on the basis of religion. So as if we are an infidel army and we are against religion, and we are fighting, supporting people who are killing our fellow Muslims. So that was a very difficult narrative to beat, but we did that. Why? Because we showed the real face of this terrorist organization. Now in Afghanistan, the situation was different in the sense that Afghan Taliban were a political entity. They were in power. So they were a political stakeholder in a country which was invaded by ISAF. The Taliban had a lot of ground support, much more than what the TTP had in Pakistan, which is very, in a very, localized affair. The Afghan Taliban had a very broad-based support.
So when the Bonn process began after this invasion, Pakistan was saying, look, get the Taliban to be a part of that process. No one understood that.
Actually, we were from day one, before even the surge has started, we had been in all conferences, meetings, whether in Pakistan, Afghanistan, international forums. We've been telling them that, look, Taliban are a political reality in Afghanistan. You have to accept that. If you look at their military defeat, even if they are defeated militarily, for example, you create an environment, still you will have to do political work. You will have to bring them in, even if as a defeated party. If they had understood at that time, the situation now would not have been...
But the Central Intelligence Agency and the US military at that point was not really in a listening mode.
Because, unfortunately, when you start suffering reverses, you need to find excuses and as his report says, apart from fudging figures and giving wrong reports of areas under control and casualties, their focus was that we are doing our best. It's Pakistan which is...
It's Pakistan. I'm going to come to that, sir.
So the blame was actually thrown on Pakistan, and that led their, focus to shift from the ground realities something which was not a ground reality.
Which is not a ground reality. At this point, we'll take a short break and return to continue with our discussion of the papers that finally contain the truth about the unwinnable war in Afghanistan. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. We continue with our discussion of Afghanistan Papers that were put out by the Washington Post. We still have with us Lieutenant General Waheed Arshad. We also joined by Ahmed Rashid, who's a well-known author, analyst, who's done a lot of work on Central Asia and Afghanistan. And given the papers that we're discussing, Ahmed had a book out which essentially talks about lots of things that have now come out, and it was titled Descent into Chaos, the United States and the Failure of Nation Building. Thank you, Ahmed, for being with us. We also have with us Hashim Wahdatyar, who's a senior program manager at Civic with over 15 years experience in regional cooperation and development in South and Central Asia and also the Middle East. Thank you, Mr. Wahdatyar, for being on the program. Let me begin with Ahmed. Ahmed, I'm sure there's nothing new in these papers for you. A lot of this stuff you've already written about. But since you were also at a time part of these processes during Obama administration with reference to understanding Afghanistan and what could possibly be done, just sort of recap of what your sense is about what went wrong and how.
Well, I think there was never a really serious attitude by any U.S. administration to open a dialogue with the Taliban, except for now Donald Trump. The administration, both of Obama and of Bush before him, the administrations were deeply divided within themselves. The military and the intelligence agencies, the CIA, not wanting to negotiate, the State Department and people in the National Security Council wanting to negotiate. And these divisions, I think, were crucial in the failure to have a coherent policy.
Okay.
I just want to point out that I wrote this book, Descent into Chaos, in 2008.
Yeah.
And that's 11 years ago. And look at the title. I mean, it's a doomsday title. Descent into Chaos, the United States and the Failure of Nation Building in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. Now, I was not the only one who was saying that, this is a doomsday scenario. There's no strategy. There's no U.S. Unity about anything. But the point is that there were a lot of people around at that time, Americans as well, who saw the failure coming.
Absolutely. So, Ahmed, here's the thing. One of the things that comes out, and there are a number of issues, of course, corruption, the money's coming in, blah, blah, blah. But one thing that stands out is, well, we could not really understand Afghanistan. Now, my question to you is, they had your expertise. They also had Barnett Rubin there. Barney understands Afghanistan very well. His 90s books, the first one is, apart from other analyses, went into the socio-economic and political structures of Afghanistan, the countryside and the rest of it. So here's the thing. With that kind of expertise, who was listening or not listening to how Afghanistan was to be dealt with?
Look, I think right from the beginning, there was a lot of advice right after the defeat of the Taliban. There was a lot of advice being given to Bush and Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz, the people at the Defense Department and the State Department. The problem was, first of all, they weren't listening, because unknown to us at that time was that the decision had been taken to invade Iraq. And Afghanistan was going to be a sideshow for the Americans. They were not going to commit large amounts of troops or money or effort into stabilizing Afghanistan. Instead, the whole effort was going to go into Iraq. Now, everyone soon learned about that. But of course, this proved to be the biggest mistake the Americans made. They had no strategy for Afghanistan except as a kind of holding operation while they conquered Iraq. And we all know what a mess they made in Iraq. because again, as these authors said, nobody knew anything about Iraq either. I remember lecturing in the United States where people were shocked to hear that the majority population in Iraq was Shia rather than Sunni.
That's true.
They didn't know that.
That's very true.
How can you presume to be making a policy or a strategy when such basic facts are unknown to you?
Stay with me, Ahmed. Ahmed has said two things that we were discussing before he joined us. They were not prepared to negotiate with the Taliban, and the Central Intelligence Agency and the U.S. military were the two elements that was most opposed to reaching out to the Taliban.
I think Ahmed is absolutely right. I think we also had the same sense that there is a lot of incoherence in terms of strategic thinking in those four pillars of state in the United States, the state and NSA and the president going on one side, the DOD and the deep state, thinking in a totally different manner. And one could see when the interlocutors used to come here that CENTCOM was thinking something different, purely in military terms. Loot and other people who were with the state and had the ear of the president were thinking totally different. And my sense is that Loot even had a disconnect with the DOD as well as the Pentagon, despite being ex-military. And I think that disconnect of strategic thinking and objectives in Afghanistan for their own peculiar reasons was one of the key factors that they lost sight of the environment created where they could have actually achieved a lot in Afghanistan by starting to negotiate with Taliban. At that time, the Taliban had a lot of groups. A lot of people wanted to come in. But when they saw that nobody's listening to them and everybody wants to kill them through. So I think, and then obviously the development funds and other funds, when they were given to warlords who were actually against the Taliban, everybody could see that. So the money was going down the well, so to speak.
Absolutely. In fact, the papers talk about, the Office of the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. So these guys, at SOPCO's direction in 2014, it says that they departed from its usual mission of performing audits and launched a side venture titled Lessons Learned. And we know that, since 2016, they have published at least 7 lessons learned reports, Segar, and they've mostly been talking about these things. Let me pull in Hashim Wahdatyar at this point. Mr. Wahdatyar, what is your sense of these papers? I mean, a lot of what we now have is something that over the past 18, 19 years has been talked about, written about in nuts and bolts information coming out. Now it seems to, these papers seem to corroborate all of that.
Thank you. First of all, the reports on Washington Post on Afghanistan did not surprise the Afghans. The Afghans knew this many years ago, that the war on terror is in the wrong place and in the wrong way. Mm-hmm. The sanctuaries and safe havens were not addressed. And also, there were no clear goals and objectives set for Afghanistan. Never the short-term goal, mid-term goal, and the long-term.
So hold on. Please clarify for me when you say that there were wrong goals set. You're talking about the fact that all the monies that were coming in, the reconstruction projects, the socio-economic uplift, the recruitment and training of the Afghan National Defense Forces, all of that was wrongly done. Is that what you're saying?
No, I have not said that there were wrong goals. There were not clear goals.
Okay.
By clear goals, it means that spending $1 million on one international soldier in Afghanistan. Instead, you can build a battalion in Afghanistan, build the army of Afghanistan, equip them with armed forces, equip them with air forces so that they can address today's challenges. So
you're saying there was a lot of wastage?
It's not wastage, sir. Ejaz, I have not said that it's wastage. If you can listen to me. So what I'm saying is
I'm just clarifying what you're saying, because you said $1 million is a lot of money, and it could have been used differently.
So that's what I'm saying, that we should have used that differently. By differently, it means that the United States of America, the NATO, and the international community cannot forever police Afghanistan or the region. Any state, they had to work on building the local capacity, both the forces and also the civilians institutions. So they did provide the training, they worked on that, but not in a way to address today's challenges and also to address the future threats in the country. That is number one. Point number two is that they brought like allies within Afghanistan, like the warlords who violated the human rights laws, and they were involved in criminal acts in Afghanistan. They brought them as their ally, and they partnered them they were their security companies and escorting them, and they were giving money to the Taliban, empowered the Taliban, and that made a chaos in Afghanistan. So that was the other thing. They have never relied on, we cannot say that never, but they should have strongly relied on the technocrats, educated Afghans, bring them in instead of like bringing up the warlords and other human rights violators in Afghanistan. The other major problem, the very important problem, was that previous president of the United States said that, okay, we withdraw from Afghanistan, but not saying that whether they have achieved the tangible result that they had said before or not. And then by coming President Trump, they said that, okay, we are returning back to Afghanistan, bringing the forces back to Afghanistan. So there was no clear strategy by when and what they will gain in order to withdraw.
I get your point. Just one final question before I let you go. When you say wrong priorities, when you say that the monies were not spent properly, when you say they brought in the warlords, you're saying, and you know, the argument on the other side at that time and much later also was that we needed people to help us in the field, and these are the people who had militias or forces, and therefore it was something that we had to do. But I assume that that's not an argument that impresses you too much.
Yeah, but these warlords are still there after 18 years. Mm-hmm. They had the militia, which is true, but they have now stronger roots. They empower their roots by having more millions and millions of dollars. And that is why it is difficult, and that also fuel corruptions in Afghanistan. The second important thing is that the congressmen of the United States announced in 2013 that they are felt in war against drugs in Afghanistan. Cigar announced that too. So these people have never surprised it. The important thing is that there are two important points. Point number one, Afghans were never lessons. While they were formulating their policies and strategies, the inputs from the Afghans were not part of those strategies. That's number one. Point number two, the failure of the international community is that they're developing their policies and strategies in Washington, D.C., Tokyo, London, Berlin, but they do not have their inputs from the field, what's going on in Afghanistan, the ground realities. You cannot develop strategies in Washington, D.C., London, and Berlin, and then you implement it in Kandahar, Helmand, and Baramsha.
Okay, correct. Thank you. That was Mr. Hashim Wahdatyar speaking with us. Let me quickly go back to Ahmed there. Ahmed is talking about warlords. I know that you have also written about that factor more than once. Tell us what the thinking was and how it was actually wrong, because most of these people not just helped the US military in the field, but also then joined the political constitutional structures that evolved after the invasion.
Look, I think we should be very clear. The warlords won the war. I mean, the warlords helped the Americans defeat the Taliban. They were the victors. And by the warlords, we mean the Northern Alliance, that is, those groups and factions and parties which made up an alliance of non-Pashtuns in North and Western Afghanistan. Now, and the Pashtuns were mostly with the mostly with the Taliban, or a large number of them. And the question that then arose, that American policy and American actions actually deepened this ethnic fragmentation that had started with the war and the victory of the Taliban. We saw increased ethnicity and problems. So, for example, the Taliban were condemned as being totally Pashtun and against the non-Pashtun, which was not necessarily the case, but this is how they were depicted in the media and by the Americans. I think the real problem was at that time that I think the point you made was very important, that the Taliban could have been or should have been integrated into the peace process that took place in Bonn. But remember, at that time, everyone was in a state of shock. I mean, the Americans had lost 3,000 civilians killed in the bombing of the Twin Towers. They were convinced that Afghanistan was a nest of extremists and terrorists, and they didn't want anything to do with the Taliban. Now, all along what we saw was that the Americans failed to differentiate between Al-Qaeda and other global terrorist movements and the Taliban, which was always an Afghan-based a group of Islamic fundamentalists who were not particularly interested in bombing New York or bombing London. However, they did give sanctuary to groups like Al-Qaeda and other such groups, but there was a need to operate at a different level when dealing with the Taliban.
Let me come back to you, Ahmed. You were, and when I say you, I'm talking about Pakistan Army, the Pakistan Army High Command, which was 2010, 2013. That was you as the CGS, General Kiani as Chief of Army Staff. General Kiani had also written what Steve Cole calls Kiani 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, and there was probably also a 4.0. 3.0, I went through. A lot of what General Kiani was saying is something that is now corroborated by what these papers say. So give us a sense of why you thought it was important to actually present a paper to the Americans, to tell them, look, these are the challenges and these are the opportunities.
Actually, like the discussion has been for the last 35 minutes, the sense which was building up in Pakistan was that the right picture is not being relayed to the decision makers in the US. The ground realities as they are not being portrayed as they are both in the state as well as the White House. And that was the place which was supposed to make decisions. So there was this sense that there is something amiss. And so we thought that perhaps let's change tack and let's try and convey our concerns, our reading of the ground situation in Afghanistan and along the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan in realistic terms as we saw them to the US President and the people who were part of his staff who were dealing with the war in Afghanistan. And this is exactly what was done. There were 2-3 papers which was, one of them was handed over personally by General Kiani to President Obama. And that was
3.0.
Yeah, and those papers were nothing but trying to explain to them that actually what is the ground reality and how does Pakistan look at the ground reality, because we are the country which is most affected. So to think that Pakistan should stay out of the equation, or why should Pakistan have strategic interest in Afghanistan, was a very naive view.
That was a very naive,
to say the least.
Absolutely.
So that is why we tried to impress upon the US administration, especially the President and his staff, that look, this is the ground reality. You don't expect Pakistan to keep its eyes closed to the whole situation, because and those famous words that when you switch on the light, we don't want to be standing in the wrong corner of the room. So and that needs to be understood by the Americans, instead of every time saying Pakistan needs to do more. So that loss of strategic focus from Afghanistan to Pakistan didn't take them anywhere.
And
now the situation is that the ground environment supposed to be created by military oppression is not there.
It's not there.
So now they are actually negotiating from a position of weakness, basically.
From a position of weakness. Ahmed, I have very little time left, but give me a sense very quickly of like the 1, 2, or 3 inflection points that you think determined, or essentially took the entire thing off course.
Well, I think there was really no strategic direction. They couldn't decide whether they wanted to educate women or whether they wanted to bring the Taliban into talks or whether they wanted to kill all the Taliban. And these discussions and debates led to even greater confusion in the field inside Afghanistan. They also had no strategy to deal with neighboring countries like Pakistan, Iran, etc., who were very important in the Afghan equation. I think the diversion to Iraq was probably the biggest mistake, where Afghanistan was completely, left alone. And thirdly, perhaps it was more about it. I always thought it was very simple to develop Afghanistan's economy. Afghanistan's economy was agricultural. It was not something complicated. To restore agriculture in Afghanistan in certain areas and be able to move the refugees back into those areas was not complicated or required enormous thinking, but it was never done. And instead there was a focus on a lot of image building, like that girls are being educated, which is all a good thing, but I think the key was the development of the economy,
Absolutely.
Which was never done.
Okay, thank you so much. That was Mr. Ahmed Rashid. Thank you also to Lieutenant General Waheed Arshad. This is all for tonight from Indus Special. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Meanwhile, for latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.